The Sega Saturn is a home video game console developed by Sega and released on November 22, 1994, in Japan, May 11, 1995, in North America, and July 8, 1995, in Europe. Part of the fifth generation of video game consoles, it was the successor to the successful Sega Genesis. The Saturn has a dual CPU architecture and 8 processors. Its games are in CD-ROM format, and its game library contains several ports of arcade games as well as original games. Development of the Saturn began in 1992, the same year Sega's groundbreaking 3D model arcade hardware debuted. The Saturn was designed around a new CPU from the Japanese electronics company Hitachi. Sega added another video display processor in early 1994 to better compete with Sony's forthcoming PlayStation. The Saturn was initially successful in Japan but failed to sell in large numbers in the United States, where it was hindered by a surprise May 1995 launch, 4 months before its scheduled release date. After the debut of the Nintendo 64 in late 1996, the Saturn rapidly lost market share in the US, where it was discontinued in 1998, having sold 9.26 million units worldwide. The Saturn is considered a commercial failure. The cancellation of Sonic X-treme, planned as the first 3D entry in Sega's popular Sonic the Hedgehog series, is considered a factor in its performance. The Saturn was succeeded in 1998 by the Dreamcast. Although the Saturn is remembered for several well-regarded games, including Nights into Dreams, the Panzer Dragoon series and the Virtua Fighter series, its reputation is mixed due to its complex hardware design and limited third-party support. Sega's management has been criticized for its decisions during the Saturn's development and discontinuation. Development of the Saturn was supervised by Hideki Sato, Sega's director and deputy general manager of research and development. According to the project manager Hideki Okamura, the project started over 2 years before the Saturn was showcased at the Tokyo Toy Show in June 1994. The name Saturn was initially only the code name during development. In 1993, Sega and the Japanese electronics company Hitachi formed a joint venture to develop a new CPU for the Saturn, which resulted in the creation of the Super RISC engine, or SH2, later that year. The Saturn was designed around a dual SH2 configuration. According to Kazuhiro Hamada, Sega's section chief for Saturn development during the system's conception, the SH2 was chosen for reasons of cost and efficiency. The chip has a calculation system similar to a DSP, but we realized that a single CPU would not be enough to calculate a 3D world. Although the Saturn's design was largely finished before the end of 1993, reports in early 1994 of the technical capabilities of Sony's upcoming PlayStation console prompted Sega to include another video display processor, VDP, to improve 2D performance and 3D texture mapping. Sega considered making CD-ROM based and cartridge-only versions of the Saturn, but discarded the idea due to concerns over the lower quality and higher price of cartridge games. According to Sega of America president Tom Kalinske, Sega of America fought against the architecture of Saturn for quite some time. Seeking an alternative graphics chip for the Saturn, Kalinske attempted to broker a deal with Silicon Graphics, but Sega of Japan rejected the proposal. Silicon Graphics subsequently collaborated with Nintendo on the Nintendo 64. Kalinske, Sony Electronic Publishing's Olaf Olafsson, and Sony America's Mickey Schulhoff had discussed development of a joint Sega/Sony hardware system, which never came to fruition due to Sega's desire to create hardware that could accommodate both 2D and 3D visuals and Sony's competing notion of focusing on 3D technology. Publicly, Kalinske defended the Saturn's design. "Our people feel that they need the multiprocessing to be able to bring to the home what we're doing next year in the arcades." In 1993, Sega restructured its internal studios in preparation for the Saturn's launch. To ensure high-quality 3D games would be available early in the Saturn's life, and to create a more energetic working environment, developers from Sega's arcade division were asked to create console games. New teams, such as the Panzer Dragoon developer team Andromeda, were formed during this time. In early 1994, The Sega Titan Video Arcade system was announced as an arcade counterpart to the Saturn. In April 1994, Acclaim Entertainment announced it would be the first American publisher to produce software for the Titan. In January 1994, Sega began to develop an add-on for the Genesis, the 32X, to serve as a less expensive entry into the 32-bit era. The decision to create the add-on was made by Sega CEO Hayao Nakayama and widely supported by Sega of America employees. According to the former Sega of America producer Scott Bayless, Nakayama was worried that the Saturn would not be available until after 1994 and that the recently released Atari Jaguar would reduce Sega's hardware sales. As a result, Nakayama ordered his engineers to have the system ready for launch by the end of the year. The 32X would not be compatible with the Saturn, but Sega executive Richard Brudvik Lindner pointed out that the 32X would play Genesis games and had the same system architecture as the Saturn. This was justified by Sega's statement that both platforms would run at the same time, and that the 32X would be aimed at players who could not afford the more expensive Saturn. According to Sega of America research and development head Joe Miller, the 32X served a role in assisting development teams to familiarize themselves with the dual SH2 architecture also used in the Saturn. Because the machines shared many parts and were being prepared to launch around the same time, tensions emerged between Sega of America and Sega of Japan when the Saturn was given priority. Featuring 8 processors, the Saturn's central processing units are 2 Hitachi SH2 microprocessors clocked at 28.6 MHz and capable of 56 MIPS. It uses a Motorola 6800 running at 11.3 MHz as a sound controller, a custom sound processor with an integrated Yamaha FH1 DSP running at 22.6 MHz capable of up to 32 sound channels with both FM synthesis and 16-bit 44.1 kHz pulse code modulation, and 2 video display processors, the VDP-1, which handles sprites and polygons, and the VDP-2, which handles backgrounds. Its double-speed CD-ROM drive is controlled by a dedicated Hitachi SH1 processor to reduce load times. The System Control Unit, SCU, which controls all buses and functions as a coprocessor of the main SH2 CPU, has an internal DSP running at 14.3 MHz. It features a cartridge slot that allows for memory expansion, 16 megabits of work random access memory, RAM, 12 megabits of video RAM, 4 megabits of RAM for sound functions, 4 megabits of CD buffer RAM and 256 kilobits of battery backup RAM. Its video output, provided by a stereo AV cable, displays at resolutions from 320x224 to 704x224 pixels, and can display up to 16.78 million colors. The Saturn measures 260 mm x 230 mm x 83 mm. It was packaged with an instruction manual, control pad, stereo AV cable, and 100 VAC power supply, with a power consumption of approximately 15 W. One very fast central processor would be preferable. I don't think all programmers have the ability to program 2 CPUs, most can only get about 1.5 times the speed you can get from one SH2. I think that only 1 in 100 programmers are good enough to get this kind of speed out of the Saturn. Yu Suzuki reflecting on Saturn Virtua Fighter development. The Saturn had technically impressive hardware at the time of its release, but its complexity made harnessing this power difficult for developers accustomed to conventional programming. The greatest disadvantage was that both CPUs shared the same bus and were unable to access system memory at the same time. Making full use of the 4 kilobytes of cache memory in each CPU was critical to maintaining performance. For example, Virtua Fighter used 1 CPU for each character, while Knights used 1 CPU for 3D environments and the other for 2D objects. The Visual Display Processor 2, VDP-2, which can generate and manipulate backgrounds, has also been cited as one of the system's most important features. The Saturn's design elicited mixed commentary among game developers and journalists. Developers quoted by Next Generation in December 1995 described the Saturn as a real coder's machine for those who loved to get their teeth into assembly and really hack the hardware, with more flexibility and more calculating power than the PlayStation. The soundboard was also widely praised. By contrast, lobotomy software programmer Ezra Dreisbach described the Saturn as significantly slower than the PlayStation, whereas Kenji Ino of Warp observed little difference. In particular, Dreisbach criticized the Saturn's use of quadrilaterals as its basic geometric primitive, in contrast to the triangles rendered by the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. Ken Humphries of Time Warner Interactive remarked that compared to the PlayStation, the Saturn was worse at generating polygons but better at sprites. Third-party development was initially hindered by the lack of useful software libraries and development tools, requiring developers to write in assembly language. During early Saturn development, programming in assembly could offer a 2 to 5-fold speed increase over higher-level languages such as C. The Saturn hardware is extremely difficult to emulate. Sega responded to complaints about the difficulty of programming for the Saturn by writing new graphics libraries which were claimed to make development easier. Sega of America also purchased a United Kingdom-based development firm, Cross Products, to produce the Saturn's development system. Despite these challenges, Treasure CEO Masato Maegawa stated that the Nintendo 64 was more difficult to develop for than the Saturn. Traveler's Tales founder John Burton felt that while the PlayStation was easier to get started on, you quickly reach its limits, whereas the Saturn's complicated hardware had the ability to improve the speed and look of a game when all used together correctly. A major criticism was the Saturn's use of 2D sprites to generate polygons and simulate 3D space. The PlayStation used a different design, based entirely on 3D triangle-based polygonal rendering, with no direct 2D support. As a result, several analysts described the Saturn as an essentially 2D system. First North American controller, 3D pad. Arcade Racer Model 1 North American/European controller, 3D pad. Arcade Racer. Second North American controller, Saturn multi-tap. RAM backup cartridge. Model 2 North American/European controller, Saturn multi-tap. RAM backup cartridge. Several Saturn models were produced in Japan. An updated model in a recolored light gray, officially white, was released at 20,000 yen to reduce the system's cost and raise its appeal among women and younger children. Two models were released by third parties. Hitachi released the High Saturn, a smaller model equipped with a car navigation function, while JVC released the V Saturn. Saturn controllers came in various color schemes to match different modules of the console. The system also supports several accessories. A wireless controller powered by AA batteries uses infrared signal to connect. Designed to work with knights, the Saturn 3D pad includes both a control pad and an analog stick for directional input. Sega also released several versions of arcade sticks as peripherals, including the Virtua Stick, the Virtua Stick Pro, the Mission Analog Stick, and the Twin Stick. Sega also created a light gun peripheral, the Virtua Gun, for shooting games such as Virtua Cop and The Guardian, and the Arcade Racer, a wheel for racing games. The Play cable connects two Saturn consoles for multiplayer gaming across two screens, and a multitap connects up to 6 players to the same console. The Saturn was designed to support up to 12 players on a single console, by using 2 multitaps. RAM cartridges expand the memory. Other accessories include a keyboard, mouse, floppy disk drive, and movie card. Like the Genesis, the Saturn had an internet-based gaming service. The Sega Net-Link was a 28.8K modem that fit into the cartridge slot in the Saturn for direct dial multiplayer. In Japan, a pay-to-play service was used. It could also be used for web browsing, sending email, and online chat. Because the Net-Link was released before the Saturn keyboard, Sega produced a series of CDs containing hundreds of website addresses so that Saturn owners could browse with the joypad. The Net-Link functioned with Daytona USA, Duke Nukem 3D, Saturn Bomberman, Sega Rally, and Virtual On, Cyber Troopers. In 1995, Sega announced a variant of the Saturn featuring a built-in net-link modem under the codename Sega Pluto, but it was never released. Sega developed an arcade board based on the Saturn's hardware, the Sega STV, or Titan, intended as an affordable alternative to Sega's Model 2 arcade board and as a testing ground for upcoming Saturn software. The Titan was criticized for its comparatively weak performance compared to the Sega Model 2 arcade system by Yu Suzuki, and it was overproduced by Sega's arcade division, because Sega already had the Die Hard license. Members of Sega AM1 working at the Sega Technical Institute developed Die Hard Arcade for the Titan to clear excess inventory. Die Hard became the most successful Sega arcade game produced in the United States at that point. Other games released for the Titan include Golden Axe, The Duel and Virtua Fighter Kids.